The United States put a 15-point peace plan on the table. Iran called it maximalist and unreasonable. Then Iran put a 5-point counterplan on the table. The White House said Trump is prepared to unleash hell. And 4 separate polls now show that most Americans oppose this war. It is Thursday, March 26, 2026. Day 27 of Operation Epic Fury. The diplomatic window is narrowing. The bombs are still falling. And the distance between the two sides' positions has never been more precisely documented, or more starkly wide. This is episode 27 of Epic Fury, the U.S.-Iran War podcast. Let's get into it. Start with the substance of what was actually on the table this week, because the details of both plans reveal more about where this conflict can and cannot go than any statement from any spokesperson. The 15-point United States proposal was transmitted to Iran through Pakistan and became public on Wednesday. 2 Pakistani officials and an Egyptian official involved in the mediation described its contents broadly. The proposal includes sanctions relief for Iran, a rollback of Iran's nuclear program, including the decommissioning of 3 key facilities, Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow, limits on Iran's ballistic missile program, restricting it to self-defense use, a cessation of Iranian support for its proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran-backed militias in Iraq, Iran's formal acknowledgement of Israel's right to exist, and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to all international shipping. In return, the United States would lift Iran's nuclear-related sanctions, assist Iran in developing a civilian nuclear program including electricity generation at the Bushehr plant, and remove the snapback mechanism that automatically reimposed international sanctions on Iran for noncompliance. The proposal also reportedly included the possibility of a 1-month ceasefire during which both sides would negotiate the final details, similar to the structure used in the Gaza ceasefire agreement last year. The 15-point plan is, in effect, a demand that Iran accept the complete dismantlement of everything that has made it a regional power for the past 4 decades, its nuclear enrichment capability, its missile program, its proxy network, and its leverage over the strait. In exchange, it gets economic relief and a civilian nuclear program it already had before the war began. Before the war began, Iran was in nuclear negotiations with the United States. Those talks collapsed in part because Witkoff and the U.S. team demanded zero enrichment, something Iran had consistently said was a red line. Iran went to war with that position unresolved. For weeks later, the same zero enrichment demand appears to be in the 15-point plan. The war has destroyed enormous amounts of Iranian infrastructure, killed over 1,200 people inside Iran, and displaced millions. But the fundamental negotiating chasm that existed before February 28 appears to remain in place. Whether the military destruction has changed Iran's calculations sufficiently to accept what it rejected before the bombs fell is the central question of this entire diplomatic moment. Iran's response arrived within hours. It was called the proposal maximalist and unreasonable by an official who spoke on background. Iran then published its own 5-point counteroffer through state broadcaster Press TV. Iran's conditions are as follows. A complete halt to aggression and assassinations by the United States and Israel. The establishment of concrete mechanisms to ensure the war is not reimposed on Iran. Guaranteed and clearly defined payment of war damages and reparations. A comprehensive end to the war across all fronts, including against Hezbollah in Lebanon and pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. And international recognition and guarantees of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, with that sovereignty framed as a guarantee for the implementation of any other commitments Iran makes. That last point deserves careful attention. Iran is not asking for the strait to reopen under current arrangements. Iran is asking for international recognition that the strait belongs to Iran, that Tehran's control over it is legally legitimate and permanently guaranteed. This is not a diplomatic opening position designed to be negotiated down. It is a demand to rewrite the foundational principles of international maritime law that have governed global shipping for decades. The Strait of Hormuz is governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which classifies it as a strait used for international navigation, through which all nations have transit passage rights that cannot be suspended. Iran is demanding that those rights be subordinated to Iranian sovereignty and Iranian permission. No American administration and no international legal community could accept that framing without fundamentally altering the architecture governing the transit of 20% of the world's oil supply. If the United States were to agree to this, it would be granting Iran a permanent veto over global energy flows that could be used as leverage in any future dispute, not just with Washington and Jerusalem, but with Riyadh, Beijing, Tokyo, or anyone else whose tankers transit the Gulf. This demand alone makes the Iranian counteroffer structurally incompatible with any agreement the United States could publicly present as a victory. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi addressed the state of the negotiations directly on Wednesday. He said on state television, "No negotiations have happened with the enemy until now, and we do not plan on any negotiations." He acknowledged that the United States is communicating through mediators. But he said an exchange of messages does not mean negotiations or dialogue. He said Iran is not seeking war and wants a permanent end to the conflict, but on its own terms, with its own conditions met. He said the American shift toward talking represents Washington's acknowledgement of failure after previously demanding unconditional surrender. That framing is significant. Iran's public position is that the United States is coming to the table from a position of weakness, that Iran has absorbed nearly 4 weeks of the most intensive bombardment in modern warfare and is still standing, still firing, still setting terms. Whether that framing is accurate is a separate question from whether Iran believes it. And there is evidence it does. A senior Iranian official told a news outlet that Iran will end the war when it decides to do so and when its own conditions are met. Trump, speaking at a fundraising dinner in Washington on Wednesday evening, said Iran wants to make a deal so badly, but they're afraid to say it for fear of being killed. He said the United States is talking to the right people. He said the deal is near. He said fake news was reporting that the United States was losing. He said we're decimating the other side. He maintained the posture of a victor in negotiations, even as Iran's foreign minister categorically denied any negotiations were taking place. The setting of the speech was itself worth noting, the National Republican Congressional Committee's annual fundraising dinner. Trump was speaking to his political base, to Republican donors and operatives, in a room where projecting strength and imminent victory was not merely a strategic choice but a social expectation. The audience wanted to hear that the war was being won. Trump told them it was. Whether that message accurately reflected the state of negotiations or was calibrated for the room is a question only the participants know the answer to. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt delivered the administration's most explicit threat since the power plant ultimatum. She said, if Iran fails to accept the reality of the current moment, if they fail to understand that they have been defeated militarily and will continue to be, President Trump will ensure they are hit harder than they have ever been hit before. She added, President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell. Iran should not miscalculate again. The gulf between Trump's optimism and Leavitt's threats reflects an administration that is simultaneously pursuing two contradictory postures. The president is projecting warmth and confidence about a deal. His press secretary is threatening the most severe military action of the entire conflict. The administration's internal diversity of message, Trump says deal near, Leavitt says unleash hell, Hegseth says we negotiate with bombs, is either a deliberate good cop bad cop strategy designed to pressure Iran into accepting terms, or it is evidence of a genuine internal disagreement about what comes next. Analysts and former officials are divided on which interpretation is correct. Both cannot be simultaneously true in the short run. One of them reflects the real policy. The question is which. Araghchi's framing of the diplomatic moment as a sign of American failure is also worth examining on its own terms. He said Washington's shift toward talking represents an acknowledgement of failure after previously demanding unconditional surrender. That is a pointed reference to the fact that in the early days of this conflict, American officials spoke as if Iran would capitulate quickly. Hegseth said in the first week that the operation would achieve its goals swiftly. Trump's original 4-week timetable has now expired. Iran is still fighting. Its leadership structure is decapitated, but a successor government is in place. Its missile inventory is depleted, but it has fired more than 400 ballistic missiles at Israel and has not stopped. From Iran's perspective, surviving 4 weeks of this bombardment while still launching daily attacks and forcing the United States to send a peace plan through Pakistan is itself a form of victory, regardless of what the physical destruction inside Iran looks like. The military picture on Wednesday provided little comfort to anyone hoping the diplomacy was producing a de facto reduction in violence. Israel launched another wide-scale wave of strikes on Iran. Iran fired fresh barrages at Israel, with air raid sirens sounding across the country. Iranian missile and drone attacks continued across the Gulf. The UAE confirmed it was intercepting drones and missiles and told residents that sound they were hearing were air defenses, not impacts. Kuwait issued a similar message. Bahrain sounded sirens and told residents to shelter in place. Saudi Arabia's eastern province was attacked again, with missiles targeting oil facilities including Ras Tanura, Gawar, and Abqaiq, the heart of the kingdom's oil production infrastructure. Iraq registered a formal diplomatic complaint with the United States on Wednesday. The Iraqi government said a strike hit near an army medical center, killing at least 7 Iraqi soldiers. It summoned the senior American diplomat in the country and described the strike as a breach of international law. Iraq's situation throughout this conflict has been uniquely difficult. It is a strategic partner of the United States while simultaneously hosting powerful Iran-backed militias that are formally part of its own government forces. The killing of 7 Iraqi soldiers in what appeared to be a U.S. or Israeli strike puts enormous pressure on Baghdad's ability to maintain its position of reluctant neutrality. Iraq has strategic interests pulling in opposite directions. It wants the Iranian threat to its government reduced, but cannot be seen as a facilitator of strikes that kill its own soldiers and destabilize its territory. The formal complaint is Baghdad's way of managing that impossible position in public. Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf posted on social media Wednesday that Iran had intelligence suggesting its enemies, with help from a regional country, are planning to occupy an Iranian island. He did not name the island or the regional country. The statement was widely read as a reference to the Karg Island blockade scenario that Washington has been openly discussing. If the United States were to move toward a blockade or occupation of Karg, through which 90% of Iran's oil exports flow, it would represent a fundamental escalation in the nature of the conflict, from aerial campaign to physical occupation of Iranian sovereign territory. The Gulf Cooperation Council nations publicly insisted this week that they must be represented in any peace talks, demanding guarantees on the free flow of energy and the cessation of Iranian missile threats. Their insistence on a seat at any negotiating table reflects how deeply the war has damaged their economies and their sense of security, and how determined they are not to be excluded from any arrangement that shapes the post-war Middle East. The polling picture inside the United States continued to shift against the war. An APNRC poll conducted between March 19th and 23rd found 59% of Americans saying U.S. military action in Iran has gone too far, 26% saying it has been about right, and 13% saying it has not gone far enough. A Quinnipiac poll from the same period found 54% of registered voters opposed to the U.S. military action. The Reuters and Ipsos poll from earlier this week found 61% of Americans disapproving. 4 separate polling organizations. One consistent finding: the American public, by a substantial majority, believes this war has gone too far. These numbers have real political consequences. The House Armed Services Committee members said Wednesday they were unsatisfied with a classified briefing from Trump administration officials on the war, its objectives, and its timeline, the latest sign that even within the Republican coalition, frustration is building. Members on both sides of the aisle said they left the briefing with more questions than answers. Democrats continued pushing for public testimony from Rubio and Hegseth before Congress. The war has now run for nearly 4 weeks without a single open congressional hearing. That absence of public accountability is itself becoming a political issue independent of the war's conduct. That polling is now influencing the war's economics in unexpected ways. The United States Postal Service announced Wednesday it will apply an 8% temporary fuel surcharge to its major domestic shipping products, including Priority Mail Express, Priority Mail, and USPS Ground Advantage. The surcharge takes effect April 26th and runs through January. USPS cited energy and fuel prices rising sharply since the war began as the reason. It is a small but concrete illustration of how the Hormuz closure is propagating through the entire American economy, down to the cost of sending a parcel across the country. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said on Wednesday that the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz is choking the movement of oil, gas, and fertilizer at a critical moment in the global planting season. That last point, fertilizer is not a detail. It is a global food security warning. The Strait is the primary transit route for fertilizer exports from Gulf producers. A sustained closure during the spring planting season means reduced fertilizer availability for farmers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The consequences of that shortage will not appear in this spring's harvest. They will appear in autumn, and then again in next year's food prices in the most vulnerable countries in the world. Guterres has been calling for a ceasefire since the first day of this conflict. His fertilizer warning is a reminder that the human costs of this war extend far beyond the immediate military theater into food security, economic stability, and the daily survival of populations who have no stake in the dispute between Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran, but who will pay for it regardless. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi called his Iranian counterpart Arachi on Wednesday and said, in terms made public, that talking is always better than fighting. He urged all parties to seize every opportunity and window for peace and called for talks to begin as soon as possible. China's public position throughout this war has been one of condemnation of the American and Israeli strikes alongside calls for diplomacy. The combination positions Beijing as simultaneously backing Iran's narrative and calling for de-escalation, a posture that gives China maximum influence over any eventual settlement without requiring it to take any military action or make any commitment that could damage its relationships with Washington. China receives roughly a third of its oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. The war has been economically painful for Beijing in ways it has not publicly acknowledged. China's quiet diplomacy reflects the calculation that it benefits most from being seen as the responsible party that helped end the war, rather than as a participant on either side. As Day 27 ends, what is clear is that both sides have now publicly put their opening positions on the record. The distance between them is vast. The United States wants Iran to dismantle its nuclear program, abandon its proxies, acknowledge Israel's existence, and reopen the Strait. Iran wants reparations, sovereignty over the Strait, an end to all hostilities across every front, and guarantees against future attack. These are not opening positions that are edging toward each other. They are positions that, if maintained, make any deal impossible. Something fundamental will have to shift in the military situation, in domestic political calculations on one or both sides, or in the economic pain that the world is absorbing before these positions can be bridged. The structural problem with the diplomatic process right now is that neither side can afford to be seen to move first. For Trump, moving toward Iran's position, even slightly, would mean abandoning demands that he has framed publicly as non-negotiable and that his base expect him to enforce. For Iran's leadership, any concession under active bombardment will be portrayed domestically and regionally as capitulation. Both sides have built their public postures in ways that make compromise extraordinarily difficult to sell to their own audiences. What mediators, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Oman, are trying to do is find a sequencing that allows both sides to claim they never conceded anything, while arriving at an outcome that ends the shooting and reopens the Strait. That is an extraordinarily delicate piece of diplomatic architecture to construct. The Gaza ceasefire of last year, which the 15-point plan reportedly uses as a template, took months of painstaking negotiation to produce and still fell apart repeatedly before it held. The Iran situation is more complex, more geographically dispersed, involves more parties, and has higher economic stakes for the entire world. Mediators are reportedly pushing for in-person talks in Islamabad, possibly as soon as Friday. If that meeting happens, if an Iranian official and an American representative sit in the same room in Pakistan, it would be the first direct contact of the war. It would not resolve the war, but it would change its trajectory in ways that cannot be predicted from the outside. History suggests that wars end through a combination of military exhaustion, economic pressure, and a specific moment when one or both sides conclude that the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. Whether Day 27 is close to that moment, or whether the conflict has weeks or months still to run, is something that only the decision-makers in Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran can assess. Whether Iran's government authorizes anyone to actually appear in Islamabad on Friday, and whether the person who appears has the authority to make any binding commitments, are the two questions that will determine whether the 5-day window closes with something or collapses into the next military escalation. 3 days remain in the 5-day window. The bombs are still falling. The Strait is still closed. The fertilizer is not moving. The cost to the global economy is still rising hundreds of millions of dollars every day. And neither side is yet willing to publicly say what it would actually accept in order to stop. This has been episode 27 of Epic Fury, the U.S.-Iran War podcast. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube to get every episode the moment it drops. Share this with someone trying to follow this story. And we will be back very soon with the next update as this diplomatic window reaches its final hours.